The moment his hand closed around her wrist, the cameras never stopped flashing. Vivian Hart froze, chest heaving, a wall of reporters shouting her name like a verdict already decided, and then a stranger in a Navy dress uniform stepped between her and the storm and said 4 words that would end his quiet life forever. "She's my wife." Nobody in that ballroom knew his name. Nobody knew he had a 6-year-old daughter waiting for him at home, or that he'd buried his real wife 2 years earlier. All they knew was what the cameras caught, and by morning, the whole country would be asking the same question. Who is this man, and why did a decorated Navy officer just lie to the entire world to save a woman he'd never met? Stay with me to the very end of this story. And before you do, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. And if stories like this move, you hit subscribe because this one is going to break your heart before it puts it back together. Caleb Morgan had learned over 11 years in the Navy how to survive things that should have broken him. Storms at sea, nights where the only sound was his own heartbeat and the hum of an engine room 3 decks below. The particular silence that comes after a casualty call when men who joke about everything suddenly have nothing to say. None of that had prepared him for a 6-year-old girl standing in a kitchen doorway, in her socks, holding up a drawing of a woman with yellow hair and wings, saying, "This is Mommy in heaven. Do you think she can see us?" He'd knelt down that morning, the morning of the gala, though he didn't know yet how much that day would cost him, and told his daughter the only thing he knew for certain. "I think she watches you every single day, baby girl, especially when you're being brave." Am I being brave? Every day. You're the bravest person I know. Lily had grinned like he'd handed her a medal, and Caleb had felt that familiar ache behind his ribs, the one that never fully went away. 2 years since Sarah's car had hit a patch of black ice on a bridge outside Norfolk. 2 years of learning how to braid hair from YouTube videos, how to check homework. He barely understood how to be a mother and a father and a sailor, all in the same 24 hours. He hadn't wanted to go to the gala. Truth be told, he'd tried 3 separate times to get out of it. "Sir, I really think Petty Officer Reyes could represent the unit just as well," he'd said to his commanding officer the week before. Captain Whitfield had looked at him over his reading glasses with the particular patience of a man who'd known Caleb since before Sarah died. "Morgan, the Navy doesn't ask you for much. You did 2 deployments back-to-back without complaint. Give me 1 night. Free open-bar rich people canapes you can't pronounce. You'll survive." "It's not the gala, sir. It's Lily. She doesn't like when I'm gone in the evenings." "Then take the sitter. Mrs. Alvarez right. She's watched Lily plenty of times. 1 night, Morgan. Shake a few hands. Let them put your face next to a plaque and you're home by 10. So there he was on a Friday night in Manhattan, standing in a rented tuxedo jacket over his dress uniform trousers, because the tailor had run out of time feeling like a man playing dress-up in someone else's life. The ballroom of the Ashford Hotel glittered with chandeliers the size of small cars. Waiters moved through the crowd holding trays of food he didn't recognize. Women in gowns that probably cost more than his truck laughed in tight little circles, and men in perfectly tailored suits talked in the low, confident voices of people who had never once worried about a light bill. Caleb checked his watch. 8:47 p.m. 2 hours, he told himself. 2 hours, and I'm back with Lily. He'd already called Mrs. Alvarez twice. "She's fine, Caleb," the older woman had laughed the second time. "She's watching cartoons and eating more popcorn than is medically advisable. Go be a hero for 1 night. God knows you deserve applause for something that isn't cleaning up juice spills." He'd almost smiled at that. A Navy PR officer named Danvers found him near the dessert table and steered him toward a small stage where 3 other service members were being recognized for a community outreach program none of them had asked to be famous for. Caleb shook hands, said, "Thank you," more times than he could count, took a photo with a plaque he didn't care about, and scanned the room the whole time like a man looking for the nearest exit. That was when he first saw her. Vivian Hart stood near the far wall in a black gown with her dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked almost severe, and even from across the room, Caleb could tell something was wrong. Not with her dress, not with her posture. She stood like a woman who'd spent her whole life being told to keep her spine straight and her chin level. It was her eyes. They had the flat, glassy look of someone doing everything in her power not to fall apart in public. He didn't know who she was yet. He'd find out in about 4 minutes the same way the rest of the room was about to find out badly loudly and on camera. It started with one reporter, a young man in an ill-fitting blazer who'd clearly slipped in on a press credential meant for someone else pushing a phone toward Vivian's face. Ms. Hart, can you confirm the reports that Hart Global falsified safety inspection records at the Ohio manufacturing plant? Vivian's smile didn't crack, not at first. I have no comment on unverified allegations. This is a private event. Is it true your father is preparing to remove you as CEO over this scandal? I said no comment. More reporters materialized like sharks smelling blood in water. Caleb would learn later that at least 2 of them had been tipped off, paid to be there, planted by someone who wanted exactly this kind of spectacle. Phones came up. A small crowd of gala guests began to drift closer, drawn by the oldest instinct in the human body, the desire to watch someone else's world collapse. Ms. Hart, sources inside the company say you knew about the falsified records for 6 months before. That's a lie. Her voice cracked on the second word. Just slightly. Just enough. Is it true you're facing a criminal investigation? Ms. Hart, why won't you answer the question? Vivian, look here. The flashes started going off in rapid, blinding succession, and Caleb watched the woman's shoulders curl inward just an inch, the universal posture of a cornered animal trying to look smaller than it is. A security guard tried to step in and got shouldered aside by a cameraman who clearly didn't care about being polite anymore. The crowd of onlookers had grown into a small wall, phones held high, nobody helping, everybody recording. Please, Vivian said, and her voice had dropped to something raw and unpolished. Something Caleb suspected she never let anyone hear. Please just give me some room. Nobody gave her room. Caleb didn't remember making the decision. That was the truth he'd repeat to himself later over and over, trying to understand how one instinct could detonate an entire life. There was no debate in his head, no weighing of consequences. There was only the sight of a person drowning in plain view of 100 people who found it more entertaining to film than to help, and something in Caleb Morgan simply would not stand for it. He moved. He didn't shove anyone, didn't raise his voice at first. 11 years of training had taught him that calm authority worked better than aggression in a crowd. He stepped into the small gap between Vivian and the nearest reporter's outstretched phone, put his hand up, palm out, and said in the same voice he used to calm frightened sailors during a fire drill, "That's enough." The reporter blinked at him. "Who are you?" And this was the moment, the one that would replay on every news channel in the country within 18 hours. The one Caleb would think about every single night for the rest of his life, wondering if he'd known some part of him, some reckless, protective, grieving part of him, exactly what he was about to unleash. He reached back without looking and found Vivian's hand. It was cold, trembling, and she flinched at the contact before her fingers closed around his like she was holding on to the last solid thing in a collapsing building. "I'm her husband," Caleb said, "and you're harassing my wife." The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. For one full second, nobody moved. Then the questions came faster, louder, more frantic than before. Because now, there was a new story. A bigger, juicier, more human story than corporate fraud allegations. A husband. A mystery husband nobody had ever heard of, standing beside Vivian Hart in a Navy uniform, gripping her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're married. Since when? What's your name? What do you do? Ma'am, is this true? You're married." Vivian's face for just an instant went through something Caleb would only be able to describe later as a kind of silent earthquake, shock, confusion, and underneath it, something that looked almost like relief, like a woman who'd been treading water for an hour and had just felt solid ground under her feet for the first time. She started. Caleb squeezed her hand. Just once. A silent message that made no logical sense and somehow communicated everything. "Follow my lead. I don't know why I did this either, but follow my lead." "We don't discuss our personal life with the press," Caleb said, steady, using the same tone he'd use briefing junior officers. "Ms. Hart came here tonight to support a cause not to be ambushed. I'd ask you to respect that." He started walking, still holding her hand, and miraculously the crowd of reporters parted. Not because they were satisfied, but because security had finally found its spine and started physically clearing a path, shouting for people to step back. Vivian moved beside him in a daze, heels clicking rapidly against marble. Her breath coming in short, controlled bursts, like she was fighting to keep herself from shaking apart entirely. They didn't stop until they were through a side door into a service hallway, the noise of the ballroom muffled behind them, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead instead of chandeliers, the sudden ordinariness of the space almost jarring. Vivian yanked her hand back like she'd only just realized she was still holding his. "What?" she said, breathing hard. "Did you just do—" Caleb ran a hand down his face. Now that the adrenaline was draining out of him, the full weight of what had just happened was starting to settle in his stomach like a stone. "I don't know." "You don't know. You just told 24 reporters that we're married. I saw a bunch of people cornering someone who clearly wanted them to stop, and none of them were stopping." He heard how it sounded, even as he said it, noble, reckless, insane. "I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I was thinking about getting you out of there. Do you have any idea who I am?" "No," he admitted. "I don't." That seemed to actually surprise her. For a second, the panic on her face gave way to something almost like curiosity. "You really don't know?" "Ma'am, I'm a Navy officer. I got dragged here tonight for a plaque ceremony I didn't ask for. I don't follow business news." He glanced toward the door they'd come through, where the muffled roar of the crowd hadn't died down at all. If anything, it sounded like it was getting louder, more chaotic. "I need to go. I have somewhere I need to be. You can't just leave." Vivian's composure was cracking now, the Ice Queen mask he'd later learned she wore like armor slipping to reveal something closer to panic. "Do you understand what you just started? By tomorrow morning, every outlet in the country is going to be running a story about my secret husband. They're going to dig. They're going to find out you're not actually married to me in about 4 hours. And when they do, it's not going to look like a misunderstanding. It's going to look like a lie. My lie. Your lie. And I am already standing in the middle of a fraud investigation that could end my career. Do you understand what a fake marriage scandal does to that?" Caleb felt the floor tilt slightly under him. He hadn't thought that far. He hadn't thought at all. Really, he'd acted on the same wiring that made him throw himself between a fistfight and a junior sailor without a second thought, the same wiring that had made him swim toward a capsized boat during a training exercise before anyone gave the order. It had never once occurred to him, in the 2 seconds it took to say, "She's my wife," that the lie would need a life of its own after tonight. "Then we correct it," he said, "right now. We go back out there and you tell them I misspoke, that I'm a family friend, whatever you want to call it. And then what?" Vivian's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Then it looks like we lied twice. First we said we were married, then we panicked and took it back the second the questions got hard. That's worse. That's so much worse. That confirms every accusation my father's people have been feeding the press for the last 3 months. That I'll say anything, invent anything to control a narrative. Your father's people." She looked at him like she'd said too much, and something shuddered behind her eyes. "It doesn't matter. It's not your problem." "With respect, ma'am, you made it my problem about 90 seconds ago." That at least made something flicker at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Fair." Caleb's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out and felt his stomach drop through the floor. 9 missed calls, 43 text messages. His name was trending on a social platform he barely used, attached to a screenshot of him gripping Vivian Hart's hand, captioned in bold letters, "Who is the mystery Navy husband?" "Oh God," he muttered. "What?" He turned the screen toward her. Vivian's face went pale. "That was fast," she said quietly. "I need to call my sitter." His hands were already moving, dialing before he'd finished the sentence, his heart hammering against his ribs, in a way it hadn't since his last deployment. Mrs. Alvarez picked up on the second ring, and he could hear the television in the background cartoons, thankfully not the news. "Caleb, are you all right? You sound... Is Lily okay? Is she asleep?" "She's fine. Sweetheart, she's right here eating popcorn." "Why, what's... I need you to not turn on the news tonight. Can you do that for me? Just please keep the TV on cartoons, and if anyone calls the house, don't answer unless you recognize the number." There was a pause on the line, long enough that Caleb could picture Mrs. Alvarez's face, the way she'd purse her lips when she was worried, but trying not to show it. "Caleb, what happened? I'll explain when I get home, I promise. Just please. Cartoons. That's all I'm asking." He hung up before she could press further, and when he looked up, Vivian was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between guilt and fascination, like she was looking at a species of person she hadn't previously believed existed. "You have a kid," she said. "A daughter. She's 6. And a wife who..." Vivian stopped herself. "She died," Caleb said flat, because 2 years hadn't made the sentence any easier to say, but had at least made it faster. "Car accident. 2 years ago." Something in Vivian's posture changed, some of the brittle defensiveness softening into something quieter. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's not your fault." He looked at his phone again, watching the notification count climb in real time, a small counter ticking upward like a countdown to something he couldn't stop. "But I need you to understand, I have a little girl at home who is about to wake up tomorrow morning to reporters camping outside our house asking about a marriage that doesn't exist, and I did that. Not you. Me. I said 4 words without thinking, and now her life is about to get turned inside out because of it." Vivian was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its sharp corporate edge entirely. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "I want you to know that. I didn't ask for a rescue, and I definitely didn't ask for a fake husband. But you did it anyway, and now we're both standing in the wreckage of a decision you made in about 2 seconds flat." She exhaled, pressing her fingers briefly against her temples, like she was fighting off a headache that had been building for hours, maybe days. "For what it's worth, thank you. Whatever comes next, thank you for stepping in tonight. Nobody else did." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. A door banged open at the end of the hallway, and a woman in a sharp gray suit came half running toward them, phone pressed to her ear. Another phone clutched in her free hand like a lifeline. "Vivian, thank God we need to get you out the back. There's a full press scrum forming at the main entrance. Somebody leaked which hotel you're staying at tonight. And..." She stopped short when she saw Caleb, her eyes narrowing with the particular suspicion of someone whose entire job was managing catastrophes. "Who is this?" "Renata, this is..." Vivian glanced at him. "I'm sorry, I don't actually know your name." "Caleb Morgan." "Caleb Morgan," Vivian repeated, testing the syllables. "He's the reason there are currently 40,000 tweets asking who my secret husband is." Renata's expression cycled through several emotions in the space of 2 seconds. Alarm calculation, something that almost looked like relief. Wait, this could actually..." She held up a hand, cutting off whatever anyone was about to say, and turned her attention fully to her phone. "Give me 30 seconds. I need to think." "Renata, there is nothing to think about," Vivian said. "This was a mistake, a misunderstanding that got out of hand. We need to correct it before it goes any further. Do you have any idea what's about to happen if you correct it?" Renata's voice had dropped low and urgent. "Your father has been feeding stories to 3 separate outlets for a week. The board meeting is in 9 days. Every single narrative right now paints you as cold, calculating, hiding something. And in the span of 5 minutes, a war hero just stood in front of a mob of reporters and called you his wife to protect you." She looked between them, something sharpening in her gaze. "That's not a scandal, Vivian. That's the best press you've had in 3 months. Renata." "I'm not saying pretend to be married forever. I'm saying tonight, right now, we do not correct anything. We say nothing. We let the story breathe. Because right now, for the first time since this whole nightmare started, the headline isn't about fraud. It's about a Navy officer defending his wife from a mob of reporters." Do you understand how that changes the entire conversation happening about you right now? Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. I have a daughter, he said again, because it seemed like the only fact solid enough to hold on to in a conversation that was spinning wildly out of his control. I can't be part of some media strategy. I have a 6-year-old who is going to wake up tomorrow and ask me why there are people outside our house. Renata looked at him properly for the first time, and whatever calculation had been running behind her eyes paused. I understand this isn't what you signed up for tonight, Mr. Morgan, but I want to be honest with you about something. The story already exists. Whether you correct it or not by tomorrow morning, reporters are going to find your name, your address, your daughter's school. That part has already happened. The only choice left is whether you walk into that storm with a plan or without one. Vivian looked like she wanted to argue, but something in her face had shifted the same flat exhaustion Caleb had seen from across the ballroom, except now it was aimed inward at a situation she clearly felt she'd lost control of hours ago. I need to go home, Caleb said. Now, tonight. My daughter comes first, and every second I stand here having this conversation is a second I'm not with her. Of course, Renata said quickly. I'll have a car take you. Discreetly a different exit than Ms. Hart, so the two of you aren't photographed leaving together. That'll buy us a little time to figure out next steps. There are no next steps, Vivian said, but her voice had lost its conviction. Caleb looked at her. Really looked the way he'd learned to look at sailors under his command, when he needed to know if what they were saying matched what they were actually feeling. And what he saw was a woman who had spent the entire night being torn apart in public, who had reached for a stranger's hand because it was the only steady thing within reach, and who was now being told by everyone around her that the disaster of her life might have accidentally become her salvation. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. For whatever this turns into, I didn't think it through. No, Vivian agreed quietly. You didn't. He turned to go, and her voice caught him at the door. Mr. Morgan. He looked back. Thank you, she said again, and this time it sounded less like politeness and more like something that had cost her to say out loud. I mean it. Caleb didn't answer. He walked out through a service exit into a cold Manhattan night, climbed into the back of a black car Renata's assistant had waiting, and spent the entire ride home, with his phone buzzing against his leg, like a trapped insect, notifications stacking up faster than he could process them. By the time the car pulled up outside his house in a quiet neighborhood 40 minutes outside the city, there were already 2 vans parked across the street with satellite dishes on their roofs, and a small cluster of people with cameras standing on the sidewalk despite the late hour. He sat in the car for a full 30 seconds, staring through the tinted window at his own front porch light at the home where his daughter was sleeping, unaware that her father had just detonated a bomb neither of them could see the blast radius of yet. Sir, the driver said gently. Do you want me to pull into the garage? Avoid the front. Yeah, Caleb said, his voice hoarse. Yeah, do that. The car eased down the side street and into the alley behind his house, and Caleb slipped in through the back door like a man sneaking into his own life. Mrs. Alvarez was sitting on the couch, and the moment she saw his face, she stood up so fast the throw pillow in her lap tumbled to the floor. Caleb, what on earth happened? My phone hasn't stopped ringing for an hour. People I don't even know are calling asking about you and some CEO. Is Lily asleep? She fell asleep on the couch 20 minutes ago. I was about to carry her up. Mrs. Alvarez studied his face, and whatever she saw there made her voice soften. Sit down. Tell me what's going on. Caleb sank onto the arm of the couch, looking down at his sleeping daughter. Her small hand still curled loosely around a stuffed rabbit that had been Sarah's before it was Lily's. He reached out and smoothed a strand of hair off her forehead, and for a moment, none of the chaos outside felt real at all. Just this small, warm sleeping weight of a life he'd promised to protect no matter what. I did something tonight, he said quietly. Something stupid. Something I can't undo. He told her everything. The reporters, the gala, the woman shaking under a wall of cameras, the 2 words that had left his mouth before his brain had caught up to them. Mrs. Alvarez listened without interrupting her expression, shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that looked disturbingly like sympathy. "Oh, Caleb," she said when he finished. "Oh, honey, I don't know what to do. There are people outside my house right now. My daughter is going to wake up tomorrow and there's going to be cameras on the lawn." "Does she know Vivian Hart? Does she know you have a family, that this isn't just some—" "She knows. I told her. About Sarah, about Lily." He rubbed both hands over his face. "Her people were already talking about using it. Like it's good for her image. Like my life is a PR opportunity." "And what did you say to that?" "I said no. I said I have a daughter, and I'm not turning her life into a headline." He looked toward the front window, where he could just make out the edge of a camera lens catching the porch light through a gap in the curtains. "But I don't know if it matters what I say anymore. It's already out there." Mrs. Alvarez was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the kind of patient, weathered wisdom that came from raising 4 children of her own and burying a husband of 40 years. "Can I tell you something? And you don't have to like it." "Go ahead. You did a good thing tonight. A reckless thing, maybe. A thing that's about to make your life very hard for a while. But you saw a person drowning, and you didn't think about yourself, you jumped in." She reached over and squeezed his hand the same way his own mother used to when he was young and scared of something he couldn't name. "That's not a mistake, Caleb. That's just who you are. The mistake was thinking a good instinct wouldn't cost you anything. Good instincts almost always do." Caleb didn't answer. He carried Lily up to bed himself, laid her down gently under her butterfly comforter, and stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her sleep, listening to the low murmur of voices drifting up faintly from the street below. Reporters already speculating, already building a story about his life out of scraps and guesses. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number. "This is Renata, Ms. Hart's chief of staff. I'm sorry to reach out so late. Vivian would like to speak with you tomorrow in person, away from cameras. She has a proposal. She'd like you to consider one that could help both of you. No pressure, but please hear her out before you say no. R." Caleb stared at the message for a long time. The blue light of the screen, the only illumination in his daughter's dark bedroom. Downstairs, the front doorbell rang once, sharp and sudden in the middle of the night, followed by a burst of muffled voices and camera shutters clicking from the street. He didn't move to answer it. He stood frozen in his daughter's doorway, his heart pounding, staring down at a text message from a stranger's assistant, and understood with the same cold clarity he'd felt the moment his hand closed around Vivian Hart's, that the life he'd built so carefully out of the wreckage of losing Sarah, the quiet, ordinary, protected life he'd promised his daughter, was already gone. Whatever came next, there was no going back to the man he'd been 24 hours earlier. Downstairs, the doorbell rang again. The doorbell rang a third time, and then a fourth, faster, now more insistent, and Caleb finally moved from the doorway of his daughter's room and went down the stairs 2 at a time before whoever was out there decided to start knocking loud enough to wake her. He didn't open the door. He pressed his eye to the peephole instead and saw not reporters, but a single police cruiser pulled up at the curb, lights off, and an officer standing on his porch with his hat in his hand, looking apologetic even before Caleb opened the door a crack. "Mr. Morgan, sorry to bother you this late. We've had some calls about people gathering outside your property. Wanted to make sure you and your family were all right and let you know we'll have a car doing extra passes on this street tonight." "I appreciate that," Caleb said, and meant it more than the officer probably realized. "There's a 6-year-old asleep upstairs. I just need this to not get worse before morning." The officer glanced past him into the house, then back at Caleb's face, and something in his expression softened. Not pity exactly, but the particular respect one uniform sometimes gives another. "I saw the clip," he admitted. "My wife sent it to me about an hour ago. For what it's worth, I don't know the whole story, but it takes something to step in front of a mob like that. It's already cost me more than I bargained for." "Yeah," the officer said. "I bet it has." He settled his hat back on his head. "We'll keep an eye on the street. You need anything, you call the non-emergency line and mention my name, Ruiz. They'll get somebody out here fast." Caleb thanked him and shut the door, and for a long moment, he simply stood in his own front hallway in the dark, listening to the cruiser pull away, listening to the murmur of voices out on the sidewalk that hadn't dispersed even with a police car sitting there. He thought about Sarah, not for any particular reason, except that this was what he did now in moments of chaos. Some part of his brain still reaching for her, the way a hand reaches for a rail on a rocking ship. What would she have said? Probably something dry and a little exasperated, the kind of thing she used to say when he came home from deployment. Having volunteered for extra duty, nobody asked him to take. "You can't save everybody, Caleb. Someday you're going to save a stranger and lose yourself doing it." He didn't sleep much that night. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone on silent, watching the notification count climb into the thousands, reading headlines that grew more absurd with each passing hour. Navy hero's secret wife, revealed as embattled. CEO who is Caleb Morgan. Hart global scandal takes romantic turn. Until he finally set the phone face down on the table because he couldn't stand to look at it anymore. Lily woke up at 6:40 the next morning, same as always, padding downstairs in her fuzzy socks, and immediately noticing that her father hadn't slept. "Daddy, you look tired." "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just a long night." He poured cereal into her bowl hands, steadier than he felt. "Hey, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be scared, okay? Can you do that for me? Do that for you." Lily looked up at him with Sarah's exact eyes, the same wide, watchful brown, and nodded seriously the way she did whenever an adult used the tone that meant this is important. "There might be some people outside today, reporters, with cameras. I don't want you looking out the front windows, and I don't want you going near the door without me, all right? It's nothing bad happened to you or me, it's just grown-up stuff, confusing grown-up stuff. Is it because of the lady you helped? Mrs. Alvarez told me a little. Not everything, just that you helped somebody." Caleb felt his throat tighten. Of course, Mrs. Alvarez had softened it for her, given her just enough to make sense of the tension in the house without frightening her. "Yeah, something like that." "Did you do a good thing?" He thought about that question longer than a 6-year-old's question probably deserved. "I think I meant to. Sometimes doing the right thing gets complicated after you've already done it." Lily considered this with the grave seriousness only small children can manage over a bowl of cereal. "Like when I gave Marcus my juice box, because he forgot his, and then I didn't have one, and I got thirsty, and it was kind of annoying, but I still don't think I did the wrong thing." Caleb laughed, the first real laugh he'd managed in almost 24 hours, and it came out cracked and a little too emotional for the moment. "Yeah, baby girl, exactly like that." He drove her to school himself instead of letting her take the bus, keeping his sunglasses on the whole way, watching in the rearview mirror as a single car with a magnetic news logo on the door followed them for 6 blocks before peeling off at a red light. His hands were tight on the wheel the entire drive, and he didn't relax until he'd walked Lily inside. Himself, spoken quietly with her teacher. A kind, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Chen, who promised to keep an eye out and call him immediately if anything or anyone unusual showed up near the school, and watched his daughter disappear safely into her classroom. Only then did he pull his phone back out and call the number Renata had texted him from the night before. She picked up on the first ring, like she'd been holding the phone the entire time waiting. "Mr. Morgan, thank you for calling. I'm not agreeing to anything," he said immediately. "I want to be clear about that before we say another word. I have a daughter, and last night a police officer showed up at my house because people were camped outside it. I'm not interested in whatever proposal Ms. Hart wants to make. I understand completely, and for what it's worth, I don't blame you." Renata's voice was calm, professional, but there was something underneath it, urgency maybe, or exhaustion. "But I'd still ask you to hear her out, not because I think you owe her anything, because I think once you understand the full situation, you'll see that saying no doesn't actually make your problem go away. It just means you face what's coming without a plan." "What is coming exactly? Can you meet this afternoon somewhere private?" Vivian would rather explain it herself. Caleb sat in his truck outside his daughter's elementary school engine, idling, and stared through the windshield at nothing in particular for a long moment. Every instinct in him wanted to say no, to hang up the phone, drive home, and try to wait out the storm from behind locked doors until the world got bored and moved on to some other scandal. But some quieter, more practical part of him, the part that had learned over 2 years of solo parenting that problems rarely disappeared just because you refused to look at them, told him that ignoring this wasn't going to make it smaller. "Fine," he said. "This afternoon, but I need to be back by 3:30 to pick up my daughter." "You'll be back well before then. I'll send you an address." The meeting took place not at some glittering corporate tower, as Caleb had half expected, but in a small, unremarkable townhouse in a quiet part of the city, a property Renata explained when she met him at the door, that belonged to Vivian's late mother and had gone unused for years, chosen specifically because no reporter would think to look for her there. Vivian was already seated in the front room when Caleb walked in, and the change in her from the night before was almost startling. Gone was the severe elegance of the gala, the tight chignon, and the flawless composure. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, and there were faint shadows under her eyes that no amount of concealer had fully managed to hide. She looked for the first time since he'd met her like an actual person instead of a headline. "Thank you for coming," she said, standing as he entered. "I know you didn't want to." "I don't have a lot of good options right now," Caleb said, not sitting down when she gestured to the chair across from her. "So let's just get to it. What's the proposal?" Vivian exchanged a glance with Renata, who was hovering near the doorway with a tablet clutched to her chest like a shield, and then folded her hands in her lap, in a way that reminded Caleb oddly of a woman bracing herself to jump into cold water. "My company is being torn apart," she said. "Not by the fraud allegations themselves, those are being handled, and frankly, most of them are fabricated or wildly exaggerated by people who want me gone. It's being torn apart by the narrative. My father has spent 3 months feeding stories to the press that paint me as cold, dishonest, unfit to run what he built. He wants the board to remove me at the annual shareholder meeting in 9 days, and up until last night, I was losing that fight badly. And last night changed that." "Last night," Vivian said. "For one evening, the story wasn't about a scandal. It was about a decorated Navy officer who stepped in to protect his wife from a media mob. People don't see corporate fraud in that story, Mr. Morgan. They see a hero and a woman worth protecting, and it is the first sympathetic headline I have had in 3 months." She looked down at her hands. "I'm not proud of what I'm about to ask you. I want you to know that going in. Ask me anyway. A marriage. On paper. Public appearances only strictly business, no emotional entanglement of any kind. 3 months, just long enough to get through the shareholder vote and stabilize the company's image. After that, we can announce an amicable separation. No scandal, no blame on either side, and you go back to your life completely unaffected, financially compensated for your time and any inconvenience." The room was silent except for the low hum of a radiator somewhere in the walls. Caleb felt something cold settle over him, the particular anger that comes from being asked to sell something you never intended to put on the market. "You want me to keep lying," he said, "to the entire country, about having a wife, while my actual wife has been dead for 2 years, and my daughter is at school right now, wondering why there were reporters outside our house this morning. I understand how it sounds." "Do you?" "Because it sounds like you want to use my dead wife's memory and my 6-year-old's life as a public relations strategy." Vivian flinched visibly like he'd struck her. "That is not what I—" "Then what is it?" "It's survival," she said, and her voice cracked on the word in a way that surprised both of them. "I have spent 11 years at that company, Mr. Morgan. I started in the mailroom when I was 22 because my father refused to hand me anything I hadn't earned, even though I was his daughter, even though half the executives assumed I'd been given the job. I clawed my way up floor by floor, while men half as qualified got promoted around me because they played golf with the right people. I have given that company everything, and now my own father is orchestrating my removal because I refused to bury a safety violation that could have gotten workers killed, and the board is one bad news cycle away from believing every lie he's telling about me." She wiped angrily at her eyes, furious at herself for the tears, and pressed her palms flat against her thighs as if to physically stop herself from shaking. I am not asking you to erase your wife's memory. I am asking you for 3 months of your time to help me save 11 years of my life. That's all this is. Sai. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, really looked the way he had the night before in the hallway, and saw not the cold, calculating CEO the tabloids had already built a caricature of, but a woman who had spent her entire adult life proving herself to people who'd already decided not to believe her. "What's in it for me?" he said finally. "Besides money I don't need, and a headache I definitely don't." Vivian looked at Renata, who stepped forward and set the tablet down on the table between them, opening to a document already prepared, clearly anticipating this exact question. Compensation obviously enough to set aside for your daughter's education entirely if that matters to you. Full legal protection. Ironclad NDA on both sides. So nothing about your real life, your late wife, your daughter's identity ever becomes part of the public story beyond what's already out. And Renata hesitated, glancing at Vivian, who gave a small, tired nod. Full media protection for your daughter. Right now, reporters are digging. They will find her school, her name, possibly photographs of her, whether you agree to this or not, because that genie is already out of the bottle. If you're inside a managed arrangement, we control the narrative around her completely. Nothing gets published without going through us. If you're outside it trying to fight this alone, you have no control over what they print about a 6-year-old at all. That landed harder than anything else in the room. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. You're saying my daughter is safer if I agree to this? I'm saying, Renata said carefully, that the exposure already happened last night the moment you said those 4 words in front of 40 cameras. The only question left is whether her exposure happens inside a plan built by people whose literal job is protecting reputations, or outside it exposed to whoever gets to her story first. Caleb walked to the window and stared out at the quiet street, hands shoved in his pockets, feeling the walls of a trap closing slowly and methodically around a decision he'd made in half a second the night before, without understanding a single one of its consequences. 3 months. He said finally, not turning around. 3 months, Vivian confirmed. No emotional involvement, strictly professional. You'd need to be present at select public events, a handful not constant, and we'd need you and your daughter to relocate temporarily to my residence, purely for appearance's sake, so the story holds up to any scrutiny. Caleb turned around so fast the coffee cup on the side table rattled. Absolutely not. Mr. Morgan, my daughter is not moving into a stranger's house to prop up your company's stock price. That's not a negotiation, that's the end of the conversation. He was already moving toward the door, his whole body rigid with a fury that had been building since the moment Renata said the word relocate. I stepped in last night because I saw someone drowning and I couldn't stand there and watch it happen. That doesn't mean I'm willing to hand you my daughter's entire life to fix your board meeting. Caleb? Vivian said his first name for the first time, and something in the shift stopped him at the door hand already on the handle. Please, just 5 more minutes. That's all I'm asking. He didn't leave, but he didn't sit back down either. Standing with his hand still on the door, every muscle in his body coiled to walk out. I know how it sounds, Vivian said, standing now, closing some of the distance between them, her voice lower, steadier, stripped of whatever performance had been in it before. I know it sounds insane moving a child into the middle of a media circus for my sake, but I want you to think about something. Reporters already know your address. By tonight, they'll likely know your daughter's school. If you refuse this arrangement and go back to your life exactly as it was, you are not protected. You are simply unmanaged. My security team is the best in the country. My legal team can bury any outlet that publishes something about a minor without consent. If your daughter comes under my roof even temporarily, she is under a level of protection your current situation cannot offer, no matter how much you want to protect her yourself. You don't know anything about protecting my daughter, Caleb said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. You're right, I don't. I've never had children. I've never had to think about a 6-year-old's safety in the middle of a media storm, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I do know what it is to have your entire life picked apart by strangers who have decided what kind of person you are before they've ever met you. And I do know that right now tonight, there are people whose entire job is finding ways to hurt me by hurting the people around me. If you refuse, they will still come after you. The only difference is whether you have my resources standing between your daughter and them or whether you're standing there alone. Caleb's phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost ignored it, but some old instinct, the one that never let a phone ring twice without answering when Lily was involved, made him check it anyway. It was a text from Mrs. Chen, Lily's teacher. "Mr. Morgan, everything is fine, but I wanted to let you know a man came to the front office claiming to be a family friend, asking to confirm Lily's last name and pickup time. Office staff turned him away, and I've alerted the front desk to be extra cautious today. Wanted you to know immediately." The blood drained from Caleb's face so visibly that Vivian took a step toward him. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He was already moving, already dialing the school's front office with hands that weren't quite steady, and the secretary who answered confirmed exactly what Mrs. Chen's text had said. A man mid-40s, well-dressed, claiming to be a friend of the family, asking pointed questions about Lily's schedule that no actual family friend would need to ask, turned away by staff who'd grown suspicious of his manner. "I need to pick her up," Caleb said, more to himself than to anyone in the room, already reaching for his keys. "Now. I need to go now." "Caleb." Vivian's voice was different now, urgent, but not for herself. "What happened?" "Someone tried to get information about my daughter at her school. A stranger asking about her schedule, her last name." His hands were shaking now, the fury and fear tangling together into something that made his whole body feel electric, dangerous, ready to break something. "This is what you meant, isn't it? This is exactly what you meant by unmanaged." Vivian's face had gone pale. "I didn't want this. I need you to believe that. I didn't ask anyone to go near your daughter. I would never—" "It doesn't matter whether you asked for it," Caleb snapped, and the words came out sharper than he intended, sharper than she probably deserved, but he couldn't stop them. "It's happening because of what happened last night, and last night happened because I opened my mouth to help you. So don't tell me you didn't want this. You wanted your headline. This is the cost of it." He was out the door before she could answer, moving fast down the front steps, already dialing the school again, to confirm they hadn't released Lily to anyone, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Renata called something after him he didn't hear, and behind him, through the closing door, he caught one last glimpse of Vivian standing frozen in the middle of the room, both hands pressed over her mouth, looking like a woman who had just watched something break that she couldn't fix. The drive to the school took 11 minutes that felt like 11 hours. Caleb ran 2 yellow lights. He'd have written up any junior sailor for running his hands, white-knuckled on the wheel, his mind cycling through every worst-case scenario a father's mind can construct in the time it takes to cross a city. When he finally pulled into the school parking lot, he was out of the truck before it had fully stopped moving at a near run toward the front doors, and the relief that hit him when he saw Lily through the office window, safe sitting in a chair swinging her feet while she waited for him, nearly buckled his knees. "Daddy." She hopped up the second she saw him, oblivious to the state he was in, and threw her arms around his waist the way she always did. He knelt down and held her tighter and longer than usual, close enough that she finally pulled back and looked at his face with concern. "Daddy, are you okay? You're squishing me." "Sorry, baby girl." He forced himself to loosen his grip, forced his voice into something calm and steady, even though his heart was still racing. "I just missed you, that's all." Mrs. Chen appeared from the office, her expression carefully neutral for Lily's benefit, but tight with worry underneath. "Mr. Morgan, can I speak with you for just a moment?" He walked a few steps away with her while Lily gathered her backpack, and Mrs. Chen kept her voice low. "The man who came by our front desk staff got a good look at him, and they described him as very deliberate, very calm. Not the kind of frantic energy you'd expect from a reporter chasing a hot story. It felt more targeted than that. More like he knew exactly what he was looking for, a private investigator." Caleb said, the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. Not press. Somebody hired. I don't know who would do that, but I wanted you to have all the information. We've already flagged Lily's file, so nobody can request information about her schedule or dismissal without you present in person. Caleb thanked her gathered Lily and drove home with his jaw set so tight it ached, replaying Vivian's words in his head the entire way. There are people whose entire job is finding ways to hurt me by hurting the people around me, and understanding with a cold, sinking certainty exactly who that man at the school had likely been working for. Not the tabloids chasing a viral clip, somebody more organized, somebody with a reason to make Vivian Hart's new husband look unstable, unreliable, or worse, somebody trying to dig up leverage before it could be used against her at that shareholder meeting Renata had mentioned. That night, after Lily was finally asleep, and the street outside had quieted to just one lingering news van parked half a block down, Caleb sat at his kitchen table with his phone in his hand for a long time before he finally called the number Renata had given him. Vivian answered on the first ring, her voice tight with something that sounded like she'd been waiting by the phone the entire evening. Caleb, is she all right? Is Lily? She's fine. She doesn't know anything happened. I made sure of that. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhausted in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. But somebody sent a man to her school today asking about her schedule. Her teacher said he wasn't acting like a reporter. He was acting like someone doing reconnaissance. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Vivian spoke again, her voice had dropped to something quiet and grim. My father. You're sure? I'm not certain of anything right now, but it fits. He's hired investigators before to dig up information on board members who opposed him, on journalists who wrote unflattering pieces about the company. If he thinks there's something to find in your life, some inconsistency in the marriage story, some vulnerability he can exploit, he would absolutely send someone to look. Even if it means going through a 6-year-old school. Her voice cracked slightly on the last part. I am so sorry, Caleb. I mean that. I never wanted your daughter anywhere near this. Caleb sat with that for a long moment, staring at the dark window above his kitchen sink, watching his own tired reflection stare back at him. He thought about what Mrs. Alvarez had said the night before. Good instincts almost always cost you something. And he thought about Renata's warning that refusing the arrangement wouldn't make the danger disappear, only remove whatever protection came with it. Tell me exactly what protection would look like, he said finally. For Lily. Not for me, not for the marriage story, for her. He could hear Vivian sit up straighter through the phone, hear the shift in her voice from guilt to something more focused, more practical. Round-the-clock security detail at whatever residence she's in. A vetted background-checked security presence at her school with full coordination with administration. Discreet, not obvious. Nothing that would make her feel like a target, but real protection nonetheless. Legal action pre-drafted and ready to file against any outlet or individual who attempts to photograph, contact, or investigate her without consent, with resources behind it that most people simply don't have access to. And my personal word for whatever that's worth to you right now, that if my father is behind this, I will use everything I have to shut it down, because sending someone after a child crosses a line even he has no business crossing. And if I say no, if I tell you I want no part of this and I'll take my chances handling it myself, then I will still do everything in my power to protect her, because whatever this arrangement is or isn't, what happened today isn't acceptable to me either. But Caleb, she paused, and when she continued, her voice was quieter, almost reluctant, like she hated saying the next part out loud. I won't lie to you and tell you that protection would be as strong outside the arrangement as it would be inside it. It wouldn't be. Not because I don't want to help you regardless, because the resources I can mobilize as the woman the world believes is your wife, are simply greater than the ones I can mobilize as a guilty stranger trying to make amends from a distance. Caleb closed his eyes. He thought about the man at the school, calm and deliberate, asking about his daughter's schedule like he was casing a target. He thought about the police cruiser outside his house the night before, about Mrs. Chen's careful, worried voice on the phone, about the particular helplessness of realizing that the world had found a way to reach toward his daughter that no amount of vigilance on his part alone could fully close off. And he thought, too, about the woman on the other end of the line who had spent this entire conversation more concerned with his daughter's safety than her own reputation, who had cracked and cursed her own father the second she suspected he was behind it. Who sounded for the first time since Caleb had met her less like a corporate headline and more like someone genuinely desperately trying to fix a mess she hadn't fully meant to create. 3 months, he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth even as he said them. But I have conditions of my own, and they're not negotiable. Name them. Lily's routine doesn't change. Her school, her bedtime, her friends, none of it gets disrupted for the sake of your press narrative. If we're doing this under one roof, it needs to actually feel like a home for her, not a stage set. No cameras inside whatever house we're in. No interviews with her ever under any circumstances, full stop. And if at any point I decide this arrangement is putting her in more danger instead of less, I walk. Immediately. No lawyers, no negotiations, no 3-month contract standing in my way. She comes first every single time, no exceptions. Agreed, Vivian said without a single second of hesitation. And something in the immediacy of her answer told Caleb she'd expected every single one of those conditions before he'd even said them. Every single one. I'll have Renata draft the agreement tonight and have it to you by morning. Caleb sat in silence for a moment after that, staring at the phone in his hand like it belonged to someone else's life. 24 hours ago, he had been a man with a quiet, careful, grief-shaped life, trying to get through one gala so he could go home to his daughter. Now he was agreeing to move that daughter into a stranger's house, to pretend in front of the entire country to be married to a woman he'd known for exactly 1 day, all because 4 words had left his mouth before his mind had caught up to his heart. Vivian, he said before she could hang up. Yes. If you ever put my daughter in a position like today's, again, if I ever have reason to believe protecting her comes second to protecting your company, this is over. Instantly. I don't care what the contract says. There was a pause, and when Vivian answered, her voice was quiet but absolutely certain. If that ever happens, Caleb, you won't need to end it. I'll end it myself. He hung up the phone and sat alone in his dark kitchen for a long time afterward, listening to the house settle around him. Listening to his daughter's soft, even breathing carried faintly down the stairs. Through the baby monitor, he still hadn't been able to bring himself to get rid of. He thought about Sarah, about what she would think of the deal he'd just made, about the strange, impossible turn his life had taken, because he couldn't stand to watch a stranger drown in a room full of people who wouldn't help her. Upstairs, Lily shifted in her sleep, murmured something unintelligible, and settled again into stillness. Caleb sat with his head in his hands and wondered, not for the first time that night, exactly what kind of life he had just agreed to build out of a lie, and whether there was any version of the next 3 months that wouldn't end with someone he loved getting hurt. The moving truck arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, and Caleb stood on the sidewalk outside his own house, watching 2 men in matching polo shirts carry boxes of his daughter's life into the back of a van, and felt something close to grief settle over him, despite the fact that nothing had actually been lost yet. Daddy, why do we need so many boxes if it's only for a little while? Lily stood beside him, clutching her stuffed rabbit, watching the process with the particular suspicion small children reserve for anything that disrupts their sense of home. Because Miss Vivian's house doesn't have any of your things in it yet, baby girl. We're bringing your things to her so it feels like home there, too. Is Miss Vivian nice? Caleb thought about the woman he'd met exactly twice, once trembling under camera flashes, once cracking with guilt over a phone call about a stranger asking questions at a school office. I think she's trying to be, he said honestly. I think she's been through some hard things, kind of like us. Like Mommy dying. Not exactly like that, but hard in her own way. Lily considered this with the same grave seriousness she brought to most things, then nodded like she'd filed the information away somewhere important. Okay, I'll be nice to her then. Everybody should get to have somebody be nice to them when things are hard. Caleb had to turn away for a second, blinking hard, because sometimes his daughter said things with such uncomplicated wisdom that it undid him faster than anything else in the world. The house itself, when they arrived that afternoon, was nothing like what Caleb had braced himself for. He'd expected something cold and museum-like, all glass and marble, and the particular sterile grandeur he associated with people who had more money than warmth. Instead, the Hart residence, a large but unpretentious stone house on the edge of the city, hidden behind mature trees and a discreet security gate, had the slightly worn lived-in quality of a place that had been a real home once decades ago, before whatever had happened to make Vivian Hart the woman she was now. Vivian met them at the door herself, which surprised Caleb dressed down again in the same casual, almost unguarded way she'd been the day of their negotiation, and she knelt immediately to Lily's eye level instead of towering over her the way most adults did with children they didn't know. "You must be Lily," she said. "I've heard you're very brave." Lily studied her with the frank, unfiltered assessment only children are capable of taking in Vivian's face. Her posture, the careful gentleness in her voice, and after a long moment that made both adults hold their breath without quite realizing it, she held up her stuffed rabbit. "This is Bunbun. He was my mom's before he was mine. Do you want to shake his paw? That's how you say hello to him." Vivian's composure cracked for just a second. Caleb saw it, the flicker of something raw crossing her face, before she smoothed it back into warmth, and she reached out and solemnly shook the rabbit's worn paw. "It's very nice to meet you, Bunbun, and you, Lily. You can call me Lilybug. That's what Daddy calls me. Or just Lily. Both are fine." "Lily, then. Thank you for letting me borrow your dad for a little while." Lily glanced up at Caleb, then back at Vivian, with the shrewd calculation of a child working out an adult negotiation she didn't fully understand, but sensed the shape of. "Is he helping you the way superheroes help people? Mrs. Alvarez said he did a hero thing?" "Something like that," Vivian said, and this time her smile reached her eyes. The first week settled into a rhythm that was stranger than Caleb had expected, and somehow less strange than he'd feared. Vivian was gone most days at the office, fighting whatever version of corporate war was unfolding behind closed doors, that Caleb only heard fragments of, and he used the time to get Lily settled into a temporary routine, drive her to her same school, despite the longer commute, because he refused to let even that piece of normalcy slip away from her, and slowly, cautiously feel out the edges of a house that wasn't his, but that he was now on paper, supposedly, the master of. The staff had been briefed carefully, a small trusted core of household employees who'd worked for the Hart family for years and understood, without needing much explanation, the value of discretion. A security detail rotated quietly around the property, visible enough to deter anyone with bad intentions, unobtrusive enough that Lily barely seemed to register them as anything other than the nice men who wave at me. It was on the fourth night during dinner that everything shifted in a way none of them had planned for. Vivian had come home late, clearly exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that made her shoulders sit differently than usual, and she'd tried to excuse herself to eat alone in her study the way she usually did, keeping the careful professional distance both of them had agreed mattered. Lily, however, had other plans. "Miss Vivian, you have to eat with us. Daddy made spaghetti and he only makes good spaghetti when he's trying to impress someone." She said this with such matter-of-fact confidence that Caleb nearly choked on his water. "Lily." He started, mortified. "That's not—" "It's true. You said it yourself last week. You said, 'I only break out the good sauce for special occasions.'" Lily turned back to Vivian, entirely unbothered by her father's rising color. "So you should probably eat with us. It would be rude not to, since he tried so hard." Vivian looked at Caleb, one eyebrow raised, something almost playful flickering behind the exhaustion in her eyes, for the first time since he'd known her. "Is that so special occasion sauce?" "She's exaggerating," Caleb muttered, though his ears were burning. "He's not," Lily said solemnly. "Sit down, please. There's a whole extra plate and everything. See, I told the cook lady you'd probably come." Vivian sat. It was, Caleb would think later, one of the strangest dinners of his life, the three of them at a long table clearly built for grander, more formal gatherings. Lily chattering happily about a science project involving volcanoes and baking soda. Vivian listening with an attentiveness that surprised him, asking follow-up questions with genuine curiosity instead of the practiced, distracted nod most adults gave children's stories. "So then what happens when you add the vinegar?" Vivian asked. "It explodes." "Well, not really explodes." Ms. Reyna said, "I'm not allowed to say explodes because parents get worried, but it foams up really big, and it looks like lava, and it's the coolest thing in the whole world." "That does sound like the coolest thing in the whole world. You could come see it when we do it at the science fair, if you're not too busy being a CEO. Lily said the word carefully, like she'd practiced it, clearly proud of having learned the term. Something passed over Vivian's face, surprise maybe, or something closer to longing, and she glanced at Caleb before answering as if seeking permission for something she wasn't sure was hers to want. "I would like that very much if your dad doesn't mind." "He won't mind. He likes it when people are nice to me." Lily twirled spaghetti onto her fork with the single-minded focus of a 6-year-old who had already moved on mentally to dessert. "Do you have a nickname? Daddy calls me Lilybug. Mommy used to call me Lilypad before she went to heaven." The table went quiet for a beat. Caleb tensed, unsure how Vivian would navigate the sudden appearance of Sarah's memory at the dinner table, but Vivian handled it with a gentleness that surprised him. "I don't have a nickname, actually. Nobody's ever given me one." "That's really sad." Lily said it with such genuine sympathy that Vivian actually laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her. "Everybody should have a nickname. Can I give you one?" "I would be honored." Lily studied her intently, chewing on her lip in concentration, the way she did whenever she was solving a problem she took seriously. "Vivian is a hard name to make into a nickname. Nessa. I'm gonna call you Nessa. It sounds like a mermaid name, and I think mermaids are the bravest because they live somewhere scary and dark, but they still shine." Vivian's eyes went bright and glassy in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. "Nessa," she repeated softly, testing the word. "I like that very much, Lily. Thank you." Later that night, after Lily had been put to bed and the house had gone quiet, Caleb found Vivian standing on the back terrace, staring out at the dark garden with a glass of wine untouched on the railing beside her. "You okay?" he asked, hovering in the doorway, uncertain of the boundaries of this strange new domestic arrangement. "Nobody's called me by a nickname since I was a child," Vivian said without turning around. "My father called me Vivian, my full name always. Even when I was small, he said nicknames were for people who didn't take themselves seriously enough. Everyone at the company calls me Ms. Hart, or Vivian if they're feeling bold. Nobody has ever just decided I was someone worth softening a name for." She finally turned to look at him, and there was something unguarded in her face that he hadn't seen before, not once, not even in the worst moments of the gala. "Your daughter did that for me in under a week. She has a gift for seeing people clearly," Caleb said, "even when they don't see themselves that way. I don't deserve it. Any of this kindness she's giving me so freely. I created this entire mess. I dragged both of you into a scandal that's putting her in danger, and she's sitting at my dinner table giving me a mermaid nickname like I'm someone worth loving." "Maybe that's exactly why she's doing it," Caleb said quietly, surprising himself with the honesty of it. "She lost her mother young enough that she doesn't remember much of her just pieces. I think some part of her has been looking for someone to fill in the shape of that loss for a long time now, and she's too young to know she's not supposed to say that out loud." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, looking back out at the dark garden. "I'm scared of that, if I'm honest with you. Not of her. Of failing her. This was supposed to be 3 months strictly professional, and I already feel—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter what I feel. That wasn't the deal." "No," Caleb agreed, though something in his own chest tightened at her unfinished sentence in a way he didn't examine too closely. "It wasn't. The piece of that week didn't last." It was 9 days into the arrangement when Renata called an emergency meeting in the study, her face tight with the particular controlled panic of someone who managed crises for a living and had just encountered one bigger than her usual toolkit. "Victor's making his move," she said without preamble, setting her tablet on the desk and turning the screen toward Vivian. "He's leaked a story to 3 outlets simultaneously, timed to drop tomorrow morning right before the shareholder meeting. He's framing the entire marriage as a calculated fraud, claiming you paid Caleb to pose as your husband specifically to manipulate public sentiment ahead of the vote. Vivian's face went white. That's not true. Not the way he's framing it. It doesn't need to be entirely true, Vivian. It just needs to be believable enough to plant doubt with the board. And he's got something else. Renata's jaw tightened. He's hired investigators digging into Caleb's military record, his finances, anything that could be twisted to make this look like a paid arrangement between two strangers instead of an organic relationship. If they find the actual contract, there is no contract they can find, Vivian snapped. It's sealed. It's privileged. It's... Vivian. Renata's voice cut through hers, sharp and urgent. He doesn't need the actual document. He just needs enough circumstantial evidence to make the public believe one exists. And there's something else. She hesitated, glancing at Caleb with something that looked almost like an apology. The investigator who approached Lily's school. We traced the firm. It's the same one Victor used 2 years ago to dig up dirt on a board member he wanted removed. Caleb felt the floor drop out from under him for the second time in 9 days. You're telling me Vivian's father sent someone to investigate my 6-year-old? I'm telling you the same firm that approached her school has been retained by Victor Hart's office. Yes, that's it. Caleb was on his feet before he'd fully decided to stand, every instinct in him screaming at the same volume it had the night he'd stepped between Vivian and a wall of cameras. That's it, I'm done. I told you both the second my daughter's safety became a bargaining chip in your family's civil war. I was walking, and here we are. Caleb, please. Vivian stood too, and there was real fear in her voice now, not for herself. I understand if you want to leave, I do, but please, let me handle this. Let me go after my father directly with everything I have before you make a decision you can't undo. If we pull out now, in the middle of his attack, it confirms every accusation he's making. It hands him the exact narrative he wants. I don't care about your narrative, Vivian. I care about my daughter not being a pawn in a war between you and your father. She's not a pawn, Vivian said, her voice cracking with an intensity that stopped him cold. She is the reason I am about to do something I have never had the courage to do in 11 years of working for that man. I'm going to expose him. Not to protect the marriage story, not to protect the board vote, because he crossed a line the moment he sent someone near a child. And I will not let that stand regardless of what happens to me or the company as a result. The room went silent. Renata looked between them, clearly recalculating something behind her careful expression. What does exposing him look like? Caleb asked finally, his voice tight but no longer moving toward the door. I have documents, Vivian said. Financial records, internal memos. Evidence that my father knew about the safety violations at the Ohio plant for over a year before they became public, and buried them because fixing them would have cost the company a fraction of what a scandal eventually did. I've been sitting on them, afraid to use them, because using them means burning the last bridge with the only parent I have left. But he sent an investigator to Lily's school. He put a child in his crosshairs to win a boardroom fight. Her voice had gone hard, now the softness of the dinner table entirely gone, replaced by something forged and unbending. I'm done protecting a man who would do that. Caleb studied her for a long moment, searching her face for the calculation he half expected to find, and instead finding only a kind of fierce, frightened resolve. If you do this, he said slowly, he comes after you with everything he has, not just the board vote. Everything. Let him. And if it doesn't work, if the board sides with him anyway, and you lose the company and the whole thing collapses around us, Vivian met his eyes without flinching. Then I lose the company. But I will not lose my conscience trying to keep it. Not anymore. Not after what he did. Caleb looked at Renata, who gave a small, grim nod of confirmation, and then back at Vivian standing in the lamplight of the study, with her chin raised in exactly the same posture she'd worn the night of the gala, except now it wasn't performance. It was armor she'd finally decided to actually wear instead of just display. Okay, he said quietly. Then let's do it right. But Vivian, if at any point this puts Lily at greater risk instead of less, I need your word that we pull back immediately. No hesitation. You have it, Vivian said, completely. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of quiet, tense preparation. Renata coordinated with a legal team that worked through the night, preparing documentation cross-referencing Victor's leaked story point by point, with evidence that directly contradicted it. Vivian barely slept, moving between calls with board members she was quietly building support with and sessions with lawyers, reviewing exactly how much of the safety violation paper trail could be safely made public without triggering separate legal liabilities of her own. Caleb kept Lily as far from the chaos as he could manage, though even a 6-year-old could sense the tension humming through the house like a live wire. On the second night, she climbed into his lap while he sat at the kitchen table, trying to read through a summary Renata had sent him, and studied his face with unusual seriousness. Is Nessa okay? She looks sad even when she smiles. She's dealing with some hard stuff with her dad, Caleb said carefully. Grown-up family stuff. Like when you and Grandpa didn't talk for a while after Mommy died. Caleb blinked. Surprised, she remembered that tucked away somewhere in the fog of grief-stricken months, when he and Sarah's father had barely spoken, each of them lost in their own version of unbearable loss, and unable to find their way to comforting each other. Yeah, kinda like that. You fixed it, though. You and Grandpa talk all the time now. We did fix it. It took time, but we did. Maybe Nessa and her dad can fix it too. Lily said this with the simple, stubborn optimism only children seemed able to sustain in the face of complicated adult grief, and Caleb pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head, wishing more than anything that the world could be as uncomplicated as his daughter's faith in it. Maybe, baby girl, I hope so. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning, held in a glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of Hart Global's headquarters, and Caleb, against every instinct that told him to stay far away from corporate politics that weren't his business, found himself standing outside that boardroom at Vivian's quiet, unexpected request, dressed in his Navy uniform instead of a suit, because she'd said something the night before that had stuck with him. I know it's not part of the arrangement, she'd said, uncharacteristically hesitant. But if you're willing, I'd like you there. Not to perform anything for the cameras. Just because I think I might need someone in that room who actually knows me even after 9 days better than most of the people in it who've known me for years. He'd agreed without hesitation, and now he stood at the back of the room while Victor Hart, a tall, silver-haired man with the particular cold charisma of someone who had built an empire and expected the world to keep rewarding him for it, took the floor first, methodically laying out his case for his daughter's removal with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who'd clearly rehearsed every word. The board did not sign on to be associated with a manufactured scandal, Victor said, his voice carrying easily through the room's excellent acoustics. A staged marriage timed suspiciously close to a safety crisis my daughter allowed to fester for months. I don't say this with any pleasure. She is my daughter. But this company deserves leadership untangled from personal deception. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Caleb watched Vivian's shoulders rigid at the front of the room, and saw the exact moment her spine straightened, another inch further bracing. When it was her turn, Vivian didn't reach for prepared remarks. She stood, walked to the front of the room, and set a single folder on the table. My father is correct about one thing, she said. Her voice steady in a way that Caleb, having watched her fight to hold that same steadiness together in a hallway 9 days earlier, understood the true cost of. My marriage began under circumstances that were not what they appeared to be. I won't insult this board by pretending otherwise. What began as a moment of protection during a public ambush became something more complicated, more real than either my husband or I anticipated. But I understand if that origin troubles you. She opened the folder. What should trouble you more is this. She began distributing copies down the table, her hands steady, despite what it must have been costing her. Internal safety assessments from the Ohio facility dated 14 months before the violations became public. Memos showing my father was informed of structural risks to worker safety and chose to delay remediation to protect quarterly earnings projections. And an invoice 3 days ago from a private investigation firm My father retained the same firm that approached my husband's 6-year-old daughter at her elementary school attempting to extract personal information about a minor child in order to manufacture leverage against me. The room went dead silent. Victor's face for the first time lost its composure entirely. "That is a fabrication," he said too loudly, the calm veneer cracking audibly. "A desperate fabrication from a daughter who— The invoice is real, father." Vivian's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like a blade anyway. "I have the wire transfer records. I have the firm's own admission given willingly once they understood the legal exposure they were facing for targeting a minor without consent. You sent someone after a 6-year-old girl to win a board vote, and I will not sit here and let this room believe I am the dishonest one in this family." Caleb watched from the back of the room as the temperature of the entire boardroom shifted. Board members who had walked in prepared to vote Vivian out, now exchanging uneasy glances, whispering behind hands, one older woman near the end of the table visibly recoiling from Victor with open disgust. "This meeting is adjourned," the board chairman said abruptly, standing. "We need to review this material properly before any vote proceeds. Mr. Hart, Ms. Hart legal counsel will be in touch with both of you immediately." The room emptied in a slow, stunned exodus, board members clustering in the hallway in low, urgent conversation, and Victor Hart remained seated at the head of the table for a long moment, staring at his daughter, with an expression Caleb couldn't fully read, something between fury and buried very deep beneath it, something that might have been the ghost of shame. "You've destroyed everything I built," Victor said quietly, once the room had mostly cleared. "No," Vivian said, and her voice, for the first time all morning, trembled slightly. "You did that yourself the moment you decided a little girl's safety was an acceptable price for winning. I just refused to let you get away with it." Victor straightened his jacket with a kind of brittle dignity and walked out without another word, without looking at either of them. And Caleb watched Vivian's entire body seem to deflate the second the door closed behind him, all the fierce composure that had carried her through the meeting collapsing at once into something exhausted and shaking. He crossed the room and caught her before her knees fully gave out, one arm around her shoulders, steadying her the way he'd steady a sailor after a close call at sea. "You did it," he said quietly. "You actually did it." "I don't know what I did," Vivian said, her voice muffled against his shoulder, and he realized with some surprise that she was crying silently. The kind of crying that comes only after holding something in far too long. "I just know I couldn't let him get away with going after her. I couldn't." "I know," Caleb said, and found to his own quiet astonishment that his hand was moving in slow, steady circles against her back, the same gesture he used to comfort Lily after a nightmare entirely without having decided to do it. "I know you couldn't." Neither of them noticed in that moment that they were still standing in a glass-walled boardroom in full view of the hallway outside, where 2 lingering board members, and unfortunately one photographer who'd slipped past security in the confusion of the adjournment, watched the supposedly cold CEO break down in the arms of her Navy husband, and captured on a single blurry but unmistakable frame something that looked far too real to be the calculated performance either of them had promised the other it would only ever be. The photo was online within the hour. Renata called before Caleb had even made it back to the car, her voice clipped and fast in a way that told him this was worse than the usual crisis management tone she'd perfected over the past 2 weeks. "It's everywhere. Every outlet that ran Victor's fraud story this morning is now running this. Instead, the 2 of you in the boardroom, and the caption isn't about the safety violations or the investigator at the school. It's about the embrace. They're calling it proof the marriage is real." "It is real," Caleb said, before he'd fully thought through what he meant by that, and then caught himself backtracking. "I mean, the moment was real. She just watched her father get exposed as someone who'd target a child. That wasn't performance." "I know," Renata said, and something in her voice suggested she'd seen enough of the 2 of them over the past 2 weeks to have already suspected as much. "But the public doesn't parse the difference between real and performed right now. All they see is a photo that looks like genuine intimacy, released at the exact moment the fraud narrative was collapsing under its own weight. It's the best thing that could have happened to this story, and I mean that both professionally and I think more than professionally. Caleb didn't answer that last part. He didn't know how to. By the time he arrived home, the story had metastasized into something entirely different from the corporate fraud narrative that had dominated headlines for weeks. Cable news anchors who had spent days speculating about falsified inspection records were now speculating about whether Vivian Hart's marriage, dismissed as a publicity stunt by half the internet just 10 days earlier, might actually be something genuine, blooming unexpectedly out of crisis. Clips of the boardroom embrace played on a loop, commentators dissecting the tenderness of Caleb's hand against her back, the way she'd folded into him without hesitation, the particular vulnerability of a woman known for her icy composure, allowing herself to be seen falling apart. Caleb hated how much he understood watching those clips himself late that night after Lily was asleep, that none of it had been staged. He hated it because it meant something had shifted in him that he hadn't given himself permission to examine, and hating it didn't make it any less true. Vivian found him in the kitchen around midnight, still awake, staring at his phone with an unreadable expression. "You should be asleep," she said, hovering in the doorway with the same hesitance she always seemed to carry into rooms he was already in, like she still expected after 2 weeks to be told she wasn't welcome. "So should you. I can't. Every time I close my eyes I see his face. Not angry, that would almost be easier. Ashamed." For half a second, right before he walked out, I saw something in his face that looked like actual shame. And some pathetic part of me is still sitting here wondering if that means there's still a version of my father worth saving. She sat down across from him at the small kitchen table, wrapping both hands around a mug of tea she clearly wasn't drinking. "I don't know why I'm telling you this, because there isn't anyone else you can tell it to," Caleb said quietly. "That's usually why people end up telling me things at midnight. I've had a lot of practice being the last person standing when everyone else has gone to bed." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "Sarah was lucky to have you." The name landed differently coming from her than it did from anyone else. Not careful, not treading lightly around a grief she assumed was fragile, just spoken plainly, like a fact she'd earned the right to say out loud. "I think about that a lot, actually," Caleb admitted. "Whether I did right by her. Whether I'm doing right by Lily now. Some nights I feel like I'm just improvising my way through fatherhood and hoping nobody notices I don't actually know what I'm doing." "For what it's worth," Vivian said, "from where I'm sitting, you seem to know exactly what you're doing. More than most people I've ever met, actually, including people who've spent their entire lives being told they were born knowing how to lead." "That's kind, but it's not true. I nearly walked out of this whole arrangement 3 separate times in the last 2 weeks. But you didn't." "No," Caleb admitted. "I didn't." Neither of them said the obvious. Next question, why not? But it sat between them at the table anyway, unspoken and undeniable, and Caleb found himself studying the tired, unguarded lines of her face and understanding with a kind of quiet dread that the answer had stopped being about Lily's safety somewhere in the last 2 weeks and had started being about something he wasn't ready to name. The photo's fallout brought an unexpected consequence. Neither of them had anticipated renewed interest in Caleb himself. Reporters who'd spent 2 weeks digging for scandal in his background instead started running profile pieces: the widowed Navy officer, the devoted single father, the man who'd stepped into a media storm to protect a stranger and somehow found himself building a family in the wreckage. It should have felt like a relief, this shift from suspicion to sympathy. But it came with its own cost. Cameras now followed Lily's school pickups with warmth instead of hostility, which meant they still followed her at all, and every kind word printed about her father still meant her face occasionally appeared in a headline she was too young to understand. It was during this uneasy lull, Victor Hart quietly stepping back from public company matters, while an internal investigation preceded the board, tabling any vote on Vivian's leadership, pending review, the media narrative swinging in her favor for the first time in months, that the real danger arrived, and it didn't come from the press at all. Caleb was in the kitchen making dinner on an ordinary Thursday evening, 3 weeks into the arrangement, when his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Morgan, this is Detective Ramirez, City Police Department. I need to speak with you regarding an incident at Lakeside Elementary this afternoon." Caleb's stomach dropped through the floor before the detective had said another word. Lily's school. What happened? Is she okay? She's fine, sir. She wasn't harmed, but I do need you to come down to the station if possible. A man was apprehended on school grounds this afternoon after being found near the playground fence during recess with a camera and what appears to be surveillance equipment. School security detained him before he made contact with any children, and he's currently in custody, but given the ongoing media situation around your family, we wanted to loop you in immediately. Caleb was in his truck within 90 seconds, hands shaking on the wheel in a way that took him back instantly to the night of the gala. That same lurching, helpless fear of a threat he couldn't fully see or control. He called Vivian from the road, and her voice, when she picked up, went immediately taut with alarm. What happened? Someone was caught near Lily's school. Surveillance equipment. Police have him in custody. Caleb's voice cracked on the last word, despite every effort to keep it steady. I need you to tell me the truth, Vivian. Is this your father again? I don't know, Vivian said, and he could hear her already moving car keys, jingling footsteps fast against hardwood. I swear to you, I don't know, but I'm calling Renata right now, and I am finding out in the next 10 minutes. By the time Caleb arrived at the police station, Lily already sitting in the waiting area, with a school counselor who'd accompanied her, looking small and confused, but thankfully unharmed. Detective Ramirez met him with a folder already partially assembled. The man's name is Gerald Finch, freelance photographer, history of aggressive paparazzi tactics, previous complaints filed against him by 2 other public figures for stalking adjacent behavior around their children. He claims he was hired independently. No direct client named, yet working through an intermediary to obtain photographs of your daughter for what he describes as, quote, a very well-paying tabloid feature on the Real Hart family. Independently, Caleb repeated. You believe that? I believe there's a paper trail we haven't fully traced yet, Ramirez said carefully. The payment came through an anonymous shell arrangement which frankly, sir, tends to suggest someone with resources and something to hide rather than a random freelancer acting alone. Caleb didn't need the detective to spell it out further. He crossed the waiting room to where Lily sat, and she looked up at him with an expression that broke something in his chest. Not hysterical, not sobbing, just quiet and scared in the particular way children are when they sense adults are frightened on their behalf and don't fully understand why. Daddy, a man was trying to take my picture at recess, and Mrs. Chen got really scared and the police came and everybody was running, and I didn't understand what was happening. Caleb knelt in front of her, took both her small hands in his, and forced his voice into something calm, even though his heart was hammering against his ribs hard enough to hurt. You did nothing wrong, baby girl. You hear me? Absolutely nothing wrong. Some bad grown-up decisions happened around you today, but none of it is because of anything you did. Is it because of the Nessa stuff? The marriage stuff on the news? Caleb hesitated, unwilling to lie to her, but equally unwilling to hand a 6-year-old the full ugly weight of adult cruelty she wasn't equipped to carry. It's complicated grown-up stuff, sweetheart, but I promise you, I am going to fix it. I am not going to let anyone get close enough to hurt you again. Vivian arrived 20 minutes later, having broken every speed limit in the city by the look of her, when she burst through the station doors, and the moment Lily saw her, something in the little girl's careful composure finally cracked, and she launched herself out of her chair and into Vivian's arms with a force that nearly knocked the taller woman backward. Nessa, there was a scary man, and everyone was running, and I got scared. I know, baby, I know. Vivian held her tightly, one hand cradling the back of her head, and Caleb watched something in her face transform completely. The last vestiges of corporate composure burning away, entirely replaced by something fierce and unguarded and entirely maternal. You're safe now. I've got you. I am not going anywhere, and neither is your dad, and nobody is ever going to scare you like that again if I have anything to say about it. Caleb watched the two of them, Lily's small frame folded against Vivian's chest, and felt something in his own chest crack open in a way he wasn't prepared for. Not jealousy, not even surprise exactly, but a kind of aching, grateful recognition that his daughter had found in the wreckage of a lie. Neither of them had planned a person who loved her without hesitation and without being asked to. That night, once Lily had finally fallen asleep after refusing to be put to bed anywhere except curled between both adults on the living room couch, Caleb and Vivian sat together in the dark, long after she'd drifted off, neither willing to move and disturb her. "This ends," Vivian said quietly, staring down at Lily's sleeping face. "Tonight. Whatever it takes. I don't care about the shareholder vote anymore. I don't care about the board. I don't care about anything except making sure nobody ever gets close enough to scare her like that again." "You think it was your father?" "I know it was my father." Vivian's voice was flat exhausted, stripped of any remaining doubt. "Renata traced the shell payment an hour ago. It leads back to an account he's used before for exactly this kind of thing. He's escalating because the board investigation is closing in on him, and he's desperate, and desperate people do reckless, ugly things." She looked up at Caleb, and there were tears standing in her eyes that she made no effort to hide this time. "I am so sorry. I told you I would protect her, and instead my own father put a camera near her at recess. I don't know how to make this right, this. You don't fix it by apologizing," Caleb said. "You fix it by making sure it never happens again, whatever that takes." "It means going public with everything," Vivian said. "Not just the safety violations. Everything, the payment records, Gerald Finch's statement, the pattern of behavior stretching back years. It means destroying whatever's left of my father's reputation in public permanently with no chance of walking it back afterward." "Then do it. You understand what that means for us too. If I go that public, that raw, there's no controlling the narrative anymore. Everything comes out. The origin of the marriage, the contract, all of it. There's no version of this where I expose him without the truth about us coming out in the same breath." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his sleeping daughter, feeling the weight of a decision that had started as a 2-second impulse in a crowded ballroom and had somehow impossibly become the center of his entire life. "Then let it come out," he said finally. "All of it. I'm tired of living inside a lie that keeps almost getting my daughter hurt. If the truth is the only thing that actually protects her going forward, then I'd rather live with the truth than keep managing a story." Vivian looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Relief maybe, or fear, or some combination neither of them had a name for yet. Even the part where it started as a lie, even the part where the world finds out I basically paid you to marry me, even that part. Caleb held her gaze steadily. Because somewhere in the last 3 weeks Vivian had stopped being just that. I don't know exactly when it happened, and I'm not entirely sure I'm ready to say all of what that means out loud yet. But I know I'm not sitting here right now because of a contract. And I don't think you're sitting here because of one either. Vivian's breath cawed audibly, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The only sound in the room. Lily's soft, even breathing between them, a small sleeping anchor holding 2 adults steady. In a moment neither of them had planned for, and neither of them, it turned out, wanted to run from. "We should sleep," Vivian finally said, though she made no move to get up, and neither did he. "We should." Caleb agreed, equally unmoving. They stayed like that until well past 2 in the morning, Lily asleep between them, neither adult willing to be the one to break whatever fragile unnamed thing had settled over the room. And when Caleb finally did carry his daughter up to bed, he came back downstairs to find Vivian still sitting in the dark, waiting like she hadn't been able to make herself leave either. The press conference was scheduled for 3 days later, timed deliberately to coincide with the conclusion of the board's internal investigation into Victor Hart's conduct, and in that short window, the household braced itself for what everyone understood would be the most consequential 72 hours of the entire arrangement. Renata worked around the clock preparing a full legal and reputational strategy, walking Vivian and Caleb through every possible question the press might ask, every angle a hostile reporter might exploit, every worst-case scenario that could unfold once the full truth was finally made public. "You need to understand," Renata said during one particularly tense strategy session. "Once this comes out, the real origin of the marriage, the contract, the fact that Caleb was compensated there, will be people who refuse to believe anything that comes after that origin is genuine. Cynicism is easier to sell than sincerity. You need to be prepared for a segment of the public that decides this entire story, past and present, is manipulation from start to finish. Let them believe that, Caleb said. I can't control what strangers choose to think of my life. I can only control whether I tell the truth about it. And the part about your feelings for each other? Renata pressed, glancing between them, with the careful, probing look of someone who'd clearly suspected for weeks what neither of them had yet said plainly out loud. How do you plan to characterize that publicly, if at all? Vivian and Caleb exchanged a glance that lasted a fraction too long to be purely professional, and Renata's eyebrows rose slightly, though she said nothing further, simply making a small note on her tablet and moving on to the next contingency. That evening, after another long session of preparation, Caleb found Vivian standing alone on the terrace again, the same spot where she'd stood the night Lily first gave her the nickname that had unraveled something guarded in her, and he joined her without needing to be asked. The two of them settling into a silence that had become comfortable in a way neither of them examined too closely. "Are you scared?" he asked finally. "Terrified," Vivian admitted. "Not of losing the company. I've made peace with that possibility already, strange as that sounds. I'm scared of standing up in front of the entire country and saying out loud that something that started as manipulation became real, and having nobody believe me. Having them decide I'm still exactly the cold, calculating person my father's story painted me as, using a child's affection and a widower's grief as one final elaborate performance." "They'll believe you," Caleb said. "How can you be sure?" "Because I'll be standing right next to you when you say it," Caleb said. "And I've never lied about anything that actually mattered to me in my entire life. I'm not about to start now in front of the whole country about the one thing in the last 3 weeks that's actually true." Vivian turned to look at him fully, then her eyes searching his face in the dim light, and something passed between them that neither of them needed to name yet, though both of them understood without a single word spoken exactly what it was. "Caleb," she said quietly, "whatever happens after that press conference, whatever the world decides to believe about us, I need you to know that none of this, not one single moment of the last 3 weeks, has felt like a performance to me. Not the dinners. Not the nights I've sat here talking to you until it got embarrassingly late. Not the way I feel every single time your daughter runs to greet me at the door like I actually belong somewhere." Her voice caught, and she pressed forward anyway, like she'd decided she'd rather say it imperfectly than not say it at all. "I didn't expect to fall for the man I hired to save my company. I don't think there's a contract clause that covers this." Caleb reached out and took her hand, the same hand he'd taken in a chaotic hallway 3 weeks earlier without understanding what he was starting. And this time, there was no panic in the touch, no scandal detonating around them. Just two people standing quietly on a terrace in the dark, finally admitting to something that had been building steadily beneath every dinner, every midnight conversation, every quiet moment of shared fear for a little girl they both loved without reservation. "I wasn't looking for this," Caleb said softly. "I want you to know that. I built a whole life around not looking for this because I told myself Lily needed a father who was steady and uncomplicated, and falling for someone felt like the opposite of steady." He tightened his grip on her hand. "But somewhere between Bunbun's handshake and midnight tea in the kitchen, I stopped being able to convince myself this was just about protecting my daughter. It became about you too, Vivian. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks it just became true." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the weight of the admission settling between them, fragile and enormous all at once. And when Vivian finally leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder, Caleb wrapped his arms around her fully for the first time, without a camera anywhere in sight, without a crowd to perform for, without anything at all except the quiet, terrifying truth of two broken people who had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found something worth holding on to in the wreckage of a lie. Upstairs, unbeknownst to either of them, Lily stood at her bedroom window in her pajamas, having woken for a glass of water, and paused at the sight below, watching her father and the woman she'd named after a mermaid stand wrapped around each other in the moonlight. And though she was far too young to understand everything that moment meant some small, wise part of her, the same part that had handed Vivian a nickname and a rabbit's handshake on the very first night, understood enough to smile, climb quietly back into bed, and fall asleep, hoping with the simple, stubborn faith of a child who had already lost one mother that this particular grown-up mess might actually be fixing itself into something worth keeping. The morning of the press conference arrived gray and overcast, the kind of flat, heavy sky that seemed to press down on the whole city, and Caleb stood in front of the bathroom mirror, straightening the collar of his dress uniform with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking since he'd woken up. "You look like you're about to walk into battle," Vivian said from the doorway, watching him with a faint, tired smile. "Feels about right," Caleb admitted. "Just a different kind of enemy fire." Second thoughts. He turned to look at her. She wore a simple navy dress instead of her usual severe corporate armor, her hair down around her shoulders the way Lily liked it best, and there was a steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there 3 weeks earlier, back when he'd first found her trembling under a wall of camera flashes. "Not about the truth," he said. "Just about how the world's going to receive it." "Whatever happens out there," Vivian said, crossing the room and taking both his hands in hers. "I need you to know something first before we walk into that room. No matter what the board decides, no matter what the press decides to believe, the last 3 weeks were the realest thing that has happened to me in longer than I can remember. If I lose the company today, I lose it having finally told the truth. That's not nothing. That's actually everything compared to how I was living before you showed up." Caleb pressed a kiss to her forehead, something that had become natural between them, in a way that still occasionally caught him by surprise, a gesture that belonged to no contract, no arrangement, nothing except the plain fact of how he felt about her now. "Let's go tell them the truth then," he said. "All of it." Lily was waiting downstairs with Mrs. Alvarez, who had been brought along specifically because Lily had insisted with the fierce stubbornness of a 6-year-old who refused to be left out of something this important that she be allowed to come at least as far as the building, even if she wasn't permitted into the actual press room. "Are you going to tell everyone Nessa is your real wife now?" Lily asked, tugging on Caleb's sleeve as they walked toward the car. Caleb crouched down to her level, the same way he always did when something mattered enough to require her full, serious attention. "We're going to tell everyone the truth, baby girl. That it started as something complicated, but that it became something real. Does that make sense?" Lily considered this with her usual gravity. "Like how sometimes I don't like a food the first time I try it, but then I try it a bunch more times, and it becomes my favorite thing." Vivian, standing just behind Caleb, let out a startled laugh that came out half like a sob. "Yes," she said, wiping quickly at her eyes. "Exactly like that, Lily. Exactly like that." The press room at the downtown conference center was packed beyond capacity. By the time they arrived, every seat filled camera crews stacked 3 deep along the back wall. Reporters shouting questions before Vivian and Caleb had even fully taken their seats at the long table set up at the front. Renata stood off to the side, tablet in hand, her expression carefully neutral, though Caleb could see the tension coiled tight in her shoulders. Vivian raised a hand, and gradually the shouting died down into an expectant electric silence. "Thank you all for coming." She began, her voice steady, despite everything Caleb knew it was costing her to keep it that way. "I know there have been countless headlines about my marriage over the last 3 weeks. Some of them accused me of manufacturing an elaborate fraud for public sympathy. I'm here today to tell you the complete truth without spin, without a legal team's careful phrasing standing between you and what actually happened." She glanced briefly at Caleb, and he gave the smallest nod a silent go-ahead. 3 weeks ago at a charity gala, I was cornered by reporters in a moment I was not equipped to handle well. I was frightened and humiliated, and completely alone in a room full of people who found my collapse more entertaining than something worth stopping. A stranger, a Navy officer named Caleb Morgan, a man I had never met in my life, stepped in and in a split-second decision meant only to get me out of that crowd, told the room I was his wife. A ripple went through the reporters' phones and cameras angling forward. "It was a lie," Vivian continued. "I want to say that plainly because I've spent 3 weeks watching people speculate about it, and I'm done letting speculation stand in for the truth." In the days that followed, my chief of staff and I proposed a business arrangement to Mr. Morgan. A temporary contracted marriage, 3 months strictly professional, designed to help stabilize a company that was at the time under attack from a coordinated campaign to remove me as CEO. She paused, drawing a breath. Mr. Morgan initially refused. He has a 6-year-old daughter, and he had no interest in exposing her to public scrutiny for the sake of my corporate problems. He agreed only when it became clear that reporters, and later far more dangerous actors, had already begun targeting his daughter, regardless of his involvement with me, and that my resources could offer her a level of protection he could not access alone. She reached over and took Caleb's hand on the table. Not for the cameras, though the cameras caught it anyway. Flashes erupting in a bright sudden wave. What I did not anticipate, Vivian said, her voice catching for just a moment before she steadied it, is that somewhere in those 3 weeks living under one roof, sharing dinners, weathering crisis after crisis together, what began as a business arrangement stopped being one. I fell in love with a man I hired to save my career. And in the process, I fell in love with his daughter too, more completely and more unexpectedly than I ever imagined myself capable of loving anyone. A reporter near the front called out before Renata could manage the microphone rotation. Ms. Hart, are you saying the marriage is now genuine, that you intend to stay married beyond the 3-month contract? I'm saying, Vivian answered, looking directly into the camera instead of at the reporter, that I no longer think of it as a contract at all. Caleb leaned forward slightly, and the room's attention shifted to him with the same electric anticipation. I want to add something, he said, his voice carrying the same calm level authority he used to steady a room of frightened sailors. I've spent the last 3 weeks being asked over and over why I stayed. Why I didn't just correct the lie the moment it became inconvenient, walk away, go back to my quiet life. The honest answer is that I stopped wanting to walk away somewhere around the 2nd week when I realized that what I was protecting wasn't just my daughter's safety anymore. It was a family I hadn't expected to find again after I lost my wife 2 years ago. He paused, and something in his face, raw and unguarded, made even the most jaded reporters in the room go quiet. I'm not going to pretend the beginning wasn't a lie. It was. But what it became, that's the most honest thing that's happened to me since I buried Sarah. I won't apologize for that, and I won't let anyone convince me it doesn't count just because of how it started. The room erupted into a fresh wave of shouted questions, but Renata stepped in this time, raising both hands. We have time for a few more questions, but I want to move us toward the second part of today's announcement, which Ms. Hart needs to address directly. Vivian nodded, drawing herself up straighter, and the softness in her face hardened into something more resolute. There is a second matter I need to address publicly today, she said. Approximately 1 week ago, a man was apprehended on the grounds of my husband's daughter's elementary school in possession of surveillance equipment, attempting to photograph a 6-year-old child without consent. Police investigation traced the payment for this surveillance back through a shell arrangement to an account controlled by my father, Victor Hart. The room went utterly silent, the kind of silence that has weight and texture, and even the most seasoned reporters seemed to lean forward as one. My father has spent the last several months orchestrating a campaign to remove me from leadership of the company he built using fabricated and exaggerated claims about a genuine safety failure that I discovered and worked to correct, one that he in fact concealed for over a year to protect quarterly earnings. When his corporate strategy began failing, he escalated to targeting a child in an attempt to manufacture leverage against me. Vivian's voice hardened further, the last traces of hesitation burning away entirely. I have submitted full documentation of both the safety cover-up and the surveillance payment to the board of directors, to law enforcement, and as of this morning, to the outlets in this room. I will not spend one more day protecting a man who believed a 6-year-old girl was an acceptable casualty in a fight for control of a company. A reporter near the back shouted, Ms. Hart, do you have any response to your father's statement this morning that you've fabricated evidence to save your position? My father can say whatever he needs to say to protect what's left of his reputation, Vivian said evenly. I have wire transfer records. I have a signed statement from the investigator he hired. I have internal safety memos with his own signature on them. The truth doesn't require me to raise my voice to be believed, and I trust the people in this room and the public watching to look at the evidence and draw their own conclusions. The press conference stretched on for nearly another hour. Question after question, and through all of it, Caleb sat beside Vivian, occasionally answering directly, mostly simply present a steady physical anchor, while the woman beside him dismantled piece by piece in front of the entire country the careful lie her father had told about her for months. By the time they finally left the building, exhausted and drained in the particular way that comes only from public vulnerability, the story had already begun exploding across every platform. But this time, Caleb noticed with a strange, cautious relief the tone of the coverage had shifted entirely. Gone were the mocking headlines about a manufactured scandal. In their place, CEO exposes father's campaign against her defends stepdaughter's safety. It became real. Navy officer and CEO confirmed genuine relationship after scandal, and somewhat to Caleb's own surprise, a wave of commentary that framed the entire saga not as corporate manipulation, but as an unlikely, unglamorous love story that had survived being born inside a lie. The board's decision came 4 days later, delivered not through a press release, but through a personal call from the board chairman directly to Vivian's phone, and Caleb was sitting beside her on the living room couch, Lily doing homework at the coffee table nearby when the call came through. Vivian answered, listened for a long moment, her face unreadable, and then closed her eyes and exhaled a breath that seemed to release weeks of accumulated tension all at once. "Thank you," she said quietly into the phone. "Thank you for your fairness in reviewing everything." She hung up and sat still for a moment, staring at nothing, and Caleb reached for her hand, bracing himself for whatever verdict was coming. "They voted unanimously to remove my father from the board effective immediately." Vivian said, her voice thin with disbelief. "And to confirm me as permanent CEO, with a formal statement of confidence in my leadership going forward." She let out a small, shaky laugh, half relief and half something closer to grief. "It's over. All of it. The vote, the investigation, my father's campaign. It's actually over." Lily looked up from her homework, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "Is that good news or bad news?" "Very good news, baby girl," Vivian said, and for the first time since Caleb had known her, she cried openly without trying to hide it or apologize for it. Tears of relief rather than fear, and Lily, without a second's hesitation, abandoned her homework entirely and climbed up onto the couch to wrap both arms around Vivian's neck. "Don't be sad, Nessa. Good news isn't supposed to make you cry." "Sometimes it does, sweetheart," Vivian said, laughing through her tears, holding the little girl close. "Sometimes the good news is so good after so much bad news that your body doesn't know how else to let it out." Caleb watched the two of them together, his daughter's small arms wrapped around the woman who had walked into their lives as a stranger and a scandal and become somewhere along the way something closer to a mother than either of them had dared name out loud, and he felt something settle in his own chest that had been unsettled since the moment he'd said those 4 fateful words in a crowded ballroom. Victor Hart's fall from grace was swift and thorough once the board's decision became public. Facing both a formal ethics investigation and mounting legal exposure for the safety violations and the surveillance of a minor, he resigned from every remaining position tied to the company within the week, issuing a brief, carefully lawyered statement that expressed no remorse and accepted no responsibility, which surprised absolutely no one who had watched him operate over the previous month. Vivian read the statement once on her phone, standing in the kitchen while Caleb made dinner and set the phone face down on the counter without comment. "You okay?" Caleb asked, watching her carefully. "I think I expected to feel more," she admitted. "Some part of me thought exposing him would feel like victory, or vindication, or something enormous. Instead, I mostly just feel tired. And a little sad, honestly, for whatever version of him existed before all of this, if that version ever really existed at all." "You don't have to feel one specific thing," Caleb said, sliding a plate toward her. "Grief doesn't usually arrive in the shape we expect it to. Trust me, I know something about that." "Is that how it felt when you lost Sarah?" "Not what you expected." Caleb considered the question seriously before answering the way he always did when Vivian asked him something real instead of something polite. It felt like the floor disappeared, and I had to learn to stand on nothing for a while. I kept waiting for it to feel like the movie's big dramatic grief crying on the floor of the shower, that kind of thing. Sometimes it was that. Mostly it was just quiet. Just an absence I had to learn to build a life around instead of waiting for it to fill back in. He reached across the counter and took her hand. I think that's what you're feeling now, honestly. Not grief for the father you lost today. Grief for the one you never actually had. Vivian's eyes went bright again. But this time she didn't cry, just squeezed his hand tightly and nodded like something in her had finally quietly been given permission to grieve a loss that had actually happened years earlier, long before any press conference made it official. The 3-month contract technically expired on a Tuesday in late autumn, a fact that Caleb only remembered because Renata mentioned it in passing during a routine check-in call, almost as an afterthought. Technically, she said, the arrangement concludes today. I wanted to flag it in case either of you wanted to discuss next steps formally through legal channels. Caleb, sitting across the kitchen table from Vivian when the call came through on speakerphone, looked up and found her already looking back at him, something amused and tender flickering behind her eyes. Renata, Vivian said, I think we can skip the legal channels on this one. Understood, Renata said, and Caleb could hear, even through the phone, the smile in her voice. For what it's worth, I don't think I've ever been happier to have a contract go entirely unenforced. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Caleb found Vivian on the terrace again, the same spot that had become over the months something like their spot, the place where the truest conversations of their whole strange arrangement had happened. Technically, he said, joining her at the railing, we're not married anymore, contractually I mean, as of about 6 hours ago. I noticed, Vivian said, a small smile playing at her mouth. Does that change anything? Only if you want it to. I don't. She turned to face him fully, and there was nothing hesitant in her expression now. Nothing guarded, just a clear, open certainty that had taken months of quiet dinners and midnight terraces and shared crises to build. I want to be your wife for real this time, Caleb. Not because a contract says so. Not because it protects the company or manages a narrative. Because I love you, and because I love that little girl upstairs more than I ever imagined I was capable of loving anyone. And because somewhere in the last 3 months, this stopped being an arrangement and became my actual life, the one I want to keep. Caleb didn't answer with words. He reached into his jacket pocket, and Vivian's breath caught audibly when she saw what he pulled out, a small, simple ring. Nothing like the extravagant jewelry she was accustomed to chosen, he explained later, specifically because it reminded him of something Sarah once told him, that love worth keeping never needed to announce itself with size. I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, he admitted, trying to find the right moment, and then I realized there wasn't going to be a perfect moment because our whole relationship started in the middle of chaos and somehow became the steadiest thing in my life anyway. So, Vivian Hart, will you marry me for real this time? No contract, no expiration date, just us and Lily and whatever life we build from here? Vivian was crying again, but laughing too, nodding before he'd even finished the question. And when he slid the ring onto her finger, neither of them noticed the small figure standing at the top of the stairs in pajamas, having woken again for water, and paused at the sight below until Lily's delighted voice rang out from the darkness. Does this mean Nessa gets to be my real mom now? Not pretend mom, real mom. Both adults turned startled and then broke into laughter at the same moment, the particular helpless laughter of two people caught in a private, perfect moment by the one person who mattered most. Get down here, Lilybug, Caleb called, and his daughter came running, bare feet slapping against the floor, launching herself into the space between them, and Vivian knelt down immediately to catch her, pulling her into the embrace alongside Caleb. The three of them wrapped together on the terrace in the cool autumn night. Yes, Vivian said, her voice thick with happy tears, pressing a kiss to the top of Lily's head. Real mom, if that's what you want. I've wanted that since the first night, Lily said with the simple, devastating honesty only children seem capable of. Since you shook Bun Bun's paw and didn't laugh at me, The wedding, when it finally happened 3 months later, was nothing like the media circus that had launched their story. Small, private, held in the same garden. Vivian's mother had once tended before her death, attended only by people who actually mattered to them. Mrs. Alvarez, Captain Whitfield, a handful of Navy friends, a few loyal Hart Global employees who had stood by Vivian through the darkest months of her father's campaign against her. Lily served as flower girl, taking her duties with the same fierce seriousness she brought to everything, scattering petals down the aisle, while proudly announcing to anyone within earshot that she was the official rabbit ambassador, bun bun tucked safely into the crook of her arm the entire ceremony. Vivian's vows, when she spoke them, were simple and unguarded, in a way the old armored version of her would never have permitted herself to be in public. I spent 11 years believing love was a liability, something that made you weak in rooms where strength was the only currency that mattered, she said, looking at Caleb with an openness that made several guests reach for tissues. You taught me it's the opposite. You taught me that the strongest thing I ever did wasn't surviving a boardroom fight or exposing my father's corruption. It was letting a stranger's daughter give me a nickname and choosing every single day since to become the person that nickname deserved. Caleb's vows were shorter, steadier, delivered in the same calm, sure voice he'd used the night he stepped between Vivian and a wall of cameras without knowing what it would cost him. I told a lie to protect a stranger, he said. I never expected that lie to become the truest thing in my life. But it did, because somewhere between a chaotic hallway and a quiet kitchen table, I stopped protecting a stranger and started building a family. Vivian, you and Lily are the reason I know without any doubt that love after loss isn't betrayal. It's proof that the heart never actually runs out of room. Years later, when journalists occasionally revisited the story, because stories like theirs never entirely stopped being told, especially once Vivian became known not just as a rehabilitated CEO, but as a quietly fierce advocate for workplace safety reform. And Caleb, after retiring from active duty, became an unlikely public voice for military families navigating grief and remarriage. Caleb would answer the same question, the same way every single time, with the same steady, unshakable certainty that had carried him through every storm since that first, reckless, impulsive night. People ask how we met. He'd say Vivian's hand in his Lily, grown taller each year, but still calling her stepmother Nessa, still keeping Boonbun on a shelf in her room long after she'd outgrown needing him to sleep. And the honest answer is complicated. It started as a lie, a desperate split-second decision I made to protect a stranger from a crowd that wouldn't stop hurting her. He'd pause there every time and look at his wife with the same quiet wonder that had never once faded. But it became the most honest thing that ever happened to me. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive clean and simple. Sometimes it has to be built slowly out of the wreckage of a lie you never meant to tell. And when you build it with the right people beside you, it holds stronger than anything that started out true from the very first word. And that, more than any headline, more than any scandal, more than any boardroom vote or press conference or viral photograph ever could, was the story the world eventually chose to remember. Not a fake marriage that fooled the public, but a real family that survived being born in chaos and chose deliberately every single day afterward to stay.